Gwen Hartman, a successful businesswoman and owner of several women's clothing boutiques, had achieved every height she could dream of. However, Gwen always felt that her personal life was incomplete. After many failed relationships, she realized that her health and appearance were the last strongholds she could control. That's why she decided to join a prestigious fitness club and start a new chapter in her life. Immediately after her first session, her attention was drawn to a young, energetic trainer named Harry Brooks. He quickly saw Gwen as a potential gold mine and decided to use his charm to keep her as a client for months, if not years. Harry skillfully began to build his strategy. Every day during training, he complimented Gwen on her progress and determination. He praised her for every step towards perfection, and in their private correspondence, he never missed a chance to support her motivation. At first, their communication was limited to discussing workouts and nutrition, but soon it turned to more personal topics. Harry knew how to create the illusion of closeness, and Gwen began to believe that she truly mattered to him. For Gwen, this was like a breath of fresh air. She felt that Harry was the one who finally understood her. Soon, she suggested they meet outside of the gym for coffee. Harry, aware of the client's importance as a stable source of income, agreed, although he knew it might cause problems with his girlfriend, Julia. Harry and Julia had been dating for 2 years. There had never been any problems in their relationship if it hadn't been for the events that had happened. Meetings with Gwen became more frequent. She invited Harry to her spacious apartment where they could spend time alone. Although Harry was attached to Julia, he couldn't resist the material benefits and attention from Gwen. He assured her that he intended to break up with Julia, citing her financial problems, which he claimed had prevented him from taking that step earlier. After another month of secret meetings, Gwen began to feel disappointed. The role of the mistress no longer satisfied her. She wanted more, a full-fledged relationship where she would be the only woman in Harry's life. Every time she brought up the topic of Harry breaking up with Julia, he found new excuses. Soon, Gwen realized that if she wanted to be happy with Harry, she would have to eliminate her rival. Gwen was a rational person and was used to solving problems. However, the thought of eliminating Julia seemed too cruel. For several weeks, she weighed her options before deciding on a desperate course of action. The first stage of her plan was to study Julia's routine. Gwen began following her, noting the times when Julia left for work and when she returned home. She discovered that the girl often stayed late at the cafe where she worked and usually returned home alone in the late evening. This information became crucial to her plan. Gwen also thought through how to avoid potential suspicion. She decided not to use phones or electronic communication to contact Julia, so as not to leave any traces. Just in case, she researched various ways to eliminate a person without violence. Chloroform turned out to be the best option. It allowed her to put the victim to sleep without signs of a struggle. One evening, when Gwen was confident in every step, she drove to the cafe where Julia worked. She watched as Julia closed up the establishment. Julia stepped out onto the empty street and headed home. This was the moment Gwen had been waiting for. She pulled up to the curb and, not giving Julia time to think, offered her a ride, claiming that she had important information about Harry's infidelities. Shocked and uncertain, Julia got into the car. Gwen drove to a pre-selected location, a deserted parking lot near the cafe. When they arrived, Gwen pretended to be searching for the right words, but instead unexpectedly pulled out a cloth soaked in chloroform and pressed it to Julia's face. The girl tried to resist, but Gwen acted with confidence. Within seconds, Julia lost consciousness. Feeling adrenaline surge through her body, Gwen quickly tied the girl up and then moved her body into the trunk of the car. Every step had been planned in advance. Every detail was under control. She closed the trunk and headed to her country house, which had been vacant for some time and did not attract attention. When they reached the place, Gwen carried Julia's unconscious body into the basement, which she had prepared beforehand. Gwen had prepared an iron chain and metal handcuffs. The abductor chained Julia, making sure she couldn't escape. Then she closed the basement door, leaving the girl alone. Her heart was racing, but she knew there was no turning back now. Julia awoke in complete darkness. She tried to move, but the cold steel of handcuffs and chains immediately reminded her of her situation. The pain in her arms and legs from the uncomfortable position was sharp, but even stronger was the sense of fear and helplessness. She couldn't understand where she was or what had happened to her. The only thing she remembered was a woman offering to talk to her about Harry's infidelity. Julia was chained with iron cuffs, her hands bound and her body still weak from the effects of chloroform. Days turned into weeks, and Gwen visited Julia daily, bringing food and water. Gwen still couldn't bring herself to take the ultimate step: murder. The basement became a prison for both women. Julia was the captive, and Gwen was the warden, sinking deeper into her obsession with each passing day. Alone in the basement, Julia began searching for ways to free herself. Her mind was filled with despair and fear, but alongside this, a fierce will to survive emerged. She noticed that the chain she was bound to touched the edge of a metal countertop. Julia began rubbing the chain against this edge, hoping that over time, it would wear down and break. Each day became a new trial for her. Gwen, continuing to bring food, could no longer hide her anxiety. She noticed Julia losing strength but still fighting. Despite her dire situation, Julia did not give up. She knew that every effort brought her closer to freedom. Julia also observed that Gwen had become less cautious when entering the basement. She no longer checked the chain and handcuffs as carefully as before. This gave Julia hope. She continued working on weakening the chain, despite the painful blisters on her hands and the weakness from malnutrition. The day finally came when her efforts paid off. One of the chain links broke, and Julia realized she was free. Her heart raced, but she knew she had to stay calm and composed. Her escape plan needed to be precise and flawless, as the slightest mistake could cost her life. She decided to act during Gwen's next visit. Julia couldn't escape just yet. The basement was locked, and Gwen would soon bring food. She had to do everything to avoid revealing her readiness to escape. When Gwen entered the basement, Julia quietly and cautiously rose, not rushing, not showing her strength. Gwen, lost in her thoughts, didn't notice as Julia approached her. In Julia's hands was the only weapon available to her, a heavy metal bucket that Gwen had left for her to use as a toilet. Julia gathered all her strength and struck Gwen on the head. The blow was unexpected and powerful, and Gwen lost her balance. She tried to resist, but Julia, driven by fury and the will to survive, kept striking. In that moment, the fear and despair accumulated over the long weeks erupted. Gwen fell to the concrete floor and her body stopped moving. Julia fled from the basement and ran to the nearest house to ask for help. The police, who had been searching for the missing Julia for several weeks, arrived at the scene and discovered Gwen's body. The house was thoroughly examined, and all evidence pointed to Gwen having indeed held Julia captive. The basement, with its iron chains, handcuffs, and signs of long-term human presence, left no doubt about her guilt. Gwen's wealthy and influential family tried to cover up the incident as much as possible, and now the details of what happened can only be found in police reports. According to the reports, Julia's actions were classified as self-defense, but within the legal system, it was still necessary to prove that Gwen's killing was inevitable and justified. At the trial, Julia appeared as the defendant, but her lawyers, backed by psychiatrists and forensic experts, built a strong defense. They detailed the long period of Julia's captivity, the horrific conditions she endured, and the psychological pressure Gwen had exerted on her. The prosecutors tried to portray Julia's actions as disproportionate to the threat, but all evidence pointed to the fact that she had no other choice. Experts confirmed that her mental state at the time of the attack was severely impaired, affecting her ability to assess the situation properly. When it came time for the verdict, the judge considered all the circumstances. Julia was found not guilty, with the ruling that her actions were driven by the necessity of self-defense. After the acquittal, Julia was freed from charges, but her life was forever changed. She had to start over, rebuilding her mental and physical health. Harry's fate remains unknown.